right. Our next session, as you see, is titled Reflections from the Intelligence World. As we all know, in the popular imagination, intelligence is a science. The intelligence professionals always, quote unquote, get it right. In the real world, of course, intelligence is more an art. It's very difficult, impossible, in fact, to be right 100% of the time. So we have a wonderful panel to discuss these intricacies of the intelligence world. And moderating this session, we're very pleased to have Gordon Carrera, who has been a security correspondent for BBC News since June 2004. He covers counterterrorism, counterproliferation, and international security issues for BBC TV, radio, and online. Gordon has also been a State Department correspondent based in Washington and a U.S. affairs analyst for BBC News. His latest book, Intercept, The Secret History of Computers and Spies, has just been released. With that, Gordon Carrera.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for joining us. Intelligence is rarely off our TV screens or out of the pages of the newspaper. Sometimes it's fiction like The Night Manager, which I think is now running in the US. Sometimes it's fact. Sometimes the two get a little confused in the public mind, perhaps even that of policymakers. We're going to try and untangle all of that in the next 45 minutes. It's certainly true there's more about intelligence agencies and their work that's in the public domain than in the past. That's also probably increased the scrutiny on them, the questions about how effective they are, about intelligence failures, questions about how secret services need to be, and how far they've adapted to the modern world and the world of open source and big data. Big, difficult questions. Fortunately, we've got two very experienced intelligence professionals to try and answer them. John Scarlett, on my immediate left, joined Britain's Secret Intelligence Service, popularly known as MI6, in the 1970s, rose up to be the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee and then the chief of SIS from 2004 to 2009. John McLaughlin joined the CIA in the 70s as well and rose up the analytic arm to become deputy director of intelligence, then acting director of CIA until 2004 when he retired and is now at Johns Hopkins. John McLaughlin, let me start with you. When you hear phrases like intelligence failure bandied around, particularly over something like whether the intelligence community should have predicted the rise of Isil, ISIS, Daesh, what do you think of that? Do you think it's a fair criticism?
I don't think it is a completely fair criticism. In the United States, we have something we say in the intelligence business, which is there are only two kinds of outcomes, policy successes and intelligence failures. And it's, I think, very hard to judge success and failure in intelligence. Intelligence sometimes succeeds when nothing happens. I remember calling a State Department official in 2001 and saying, we know there's going to be an attack on an embassy. I can tell you how we know that, and therefore you should evacuate that embassy. And that happened, and there was no attack, and no one knows about that until this moment, maybe. The other thing about intelligence success and failure, I think, is that intelligence is generally more successful in predicting capabilities than intentions, and lots of examples of that. On the specific question of ISIL, I guess one could challenge the premise. I mean, it's often assumed that somehow people missed in the intelligence world the rise of ISIL. I don't know that that's actually true. Sometimes when the rest of the world is surprised, the assumption is that intelligence was clueless too. It turns out, I think that I have confidence that my former colleagues certainly recognized the trends that were pointing to ISIL, because we did on the outside. People on the outside, myself and others, were writing. They now have, say in 2013, they now have the largest safe haven they've ever had. Terrorists, generally. The drawdown in Afghanistan and Iran is opened up a whole field of endeavor for them that we no longer have the same granular survey of. And the disaffection of the Sunnis was evident to everyone, so the preconditions were there. And I'm confident my former colleagues were aware of that. I'll stop there. There's a lot more that can be said on that question.
John Scarlett, a similar question for you. You spent much of your career looking at Russia. Do you think there have been mistakes, failures in assessing, understanding Putin's intentions? We heard a lot about that this morning. Is that something you'd expect the intelligence community to be able to offer policymakers insight on?
Well, in a way, it picks up and is linked to what John has just been saying. I mean, I'm just tempted to add that for obvious reasons, in the intelligence world, failures get learned about, and you know about them, and the vast majority of successes can't be known about, and it shouldn't be known about. And it's just the way it is, because intelligence is meant to be secret. You know, in the intelligence world, secret is good. I know that, you know, in other worlds, it's not. And then the second thing is, there's a tendency somehow or another to pick intelligence out as if it was some unique part of the overall decision-making and understanding sort of mechanism that one has looking at a whole range of global issues. And of course, it's only part of it. And so there is a tendency in the case of Russia and Russian behavior and Russian actions in the most recent period, and obviously in Eastern Europe and then in Syria and so on, to talk about intelligence failures. But, well, first of all, you know, like John, I don't know, and how could I know exactly what we have known, what we haven't known, because I'm no longer serving, and if I was serving, I wouldn't be sitting here. So we have to say that don't assume that one knows things when one doesn't. And secondly, it goes much wider than intelligence. In order to get your head around, say, Russian policy and Russian decision-making, it's a broad policy issue, it's an analytical issue. A whole range of people have to understand that and get this right. And they will be, at the end of the day, the decisions and the policies are set by policymakers. They're absolutely not set by the intelligence leaders and professionals. But the policymakers are influenced, of course, by what they read and what the intelligence knowledge can tell them. And so the expertise which is in that community can help to guide it.
If I could add just a point to that. Intelligence successes are often woven into a successful policy in invisible ways. Let me give you two examples. When we look back at the Balkan Wars now as a regrettable chapter of human history, things are still not perfect in the Balkans, but they're no longer fighting. That's seen as a policy success. I can tell you that intelligence was intimately involved in that, although no one would ever cite that as an intelligence success necessarily. The disarming of Libya in 2004 is when they gave up their nuclear, biological, and chemical programs, is seen, I think, as a diplomatic success. But in truth, it was preceded by about 6 months of intensive secret intelligence work that was mandated by the Prime Minister here and the President in the United States. Again, most people don't think of that as a big intelligence success, but it could not have happened without woven into the fabric of a successful policy.
The public and perhaps policymakers think intelligence agencies should give them warning, prediction, whether it's specific events like 9/11, whether it's big trends, end of the Cold War, the Arab Spring. Is that realistic? Is that what intelligence agencies should be doing? And if so, have they been doing it successfully? Because often these events have taken us by surprise. Could they be predicted?
Well, there are...
Go ahead.
I mean, you've made a division there between two types of issue, and I think that's exactly right. Predicting precise events, I mean, clearly is an intelligence function. It's actually knowing precisely, if you possibly can, that there is going to be a terrorist attack, and if there is, you want to know as much as you possibly can about where it's going to take place, and there'll be a whole stream of, some of them publicly acknowledged, most not, of successes of that kind in recent years, and time again, they go back to just good intelligence. The best form of protection against a terrorist attack is good intelligence. It's simple, that's quite precise. And then that of course can include, let's say, the sudden deployment of a significant Russian military force to Syria, that's an event. And of course, that is something which intelligence can make a critical difference to understanding, anticipating. Ditto, you might say, deployment in Crimea. It can be a combination of knowledge of the policy-making and decision-making process in Moscow, and then also a study of movements on the ground, which might not be quite so good as having the papers from the Kremlin, but still can form a basis for analytical study and conclusion, and that's based on intelligence. That's one thing. Predicting the fall of the Soviet Union is a completely different question. Sometimes, I hear people say that they predicted the fall of the Soviet Union. Personally, I was around at the time, and I was there, and I just don't believe it. If you hear anybody telling you that, don't believe it. Nobody predicted the fall of the Soviet Union.
Or the Arab Spring?
Which goes, and then picking up the Arab Spring, well, did they? I don't think they really did. Again, quite a lot of involvement in that, although I left the service by that time in terms of watching it and studying it and trying to understand it. Of course, I know people who were aware of the depth of unease and misunderstanding, the weakness or the fragility of many of the security forces and so on. But I don't think I've heard anybody really convincingly tell me that. And it's not an intelligence event. It was a wider policy-making understanding of the region, relationships with governments, a much wider set of events than pure intelligence.
Yeah, I would just add, of course, intelligence tries to predict, but I don't know whether it was Einstein or Yogi Berra, but one of them said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And so
Exactly.
on that score, what I would say is that sometimes intelligence predicts things quite accurately. A missile test, for example. Again, capabilities. Occasionally a terrorist attack. I'm thinking of getting on to the fact that Najib Zazi was about to attack the New York subway system and preventing that in advance. With terrorism in particular, you don't so much want to predict an attack, you want to catch it before it happens. You want to disrupt it further down the chain, not at the point when they're striking the match or pressing the detonator. And so on terrorism in particular, I think both the UK and the United States have been pretty successful in terms of getting ahead of the terrorist game, with the obvious exceptions. More interesting question might be, how does intelligence do once an event occurs that hasn't been predicted? That's another subject.
What advice can it offer policymakers at that point, you mean?
That's often where intelligence has to step in. Countless examples of that. Let's take 9/11 as an example. I often characterize 9/11 as not a strategic intelligence failure, but certainly a tactical intelligence failure. Not strategic in the sense that, read the 9/11 Commission report. The CIA was saying the lights are blinking red all summer long before 9/11. We could see a big attack coming. We didn't know the precise target or method. Once it happened, though, we had teams on the ground in Afghanistan within 15 days.
Yeah.
Once it happened, we had a plan on the president's desk within a week for what to do about it, and that plan was largely followed. And countless other examples of kind of responding to something very quickly in a way that allows policy to kind of get ahead of it.
One of the criticisms of the intelligence community after 9/11 was that it got too close to policymakers, too close to politicians.
Yeah.
Of course, that relates to Iraq. I'm not sure with the Chilcot inquiry how much you can say about that, John Scarlett, but that's been a criticism about that period, that the distance that an intelligence agency needs to speak truth to power was somehow lost in that period. It was sucked into that political maelstrom post 9/11.
Well, I can only speak for the UK. Of course, I know that criticism is there. I don't accept it. I don't think it's true. And I think and time again, if you look at the way the British intelligence services and community has performed and behaved, over the years, the last 20 years, let's say, it's a very strong feature of it that there's been an acute understanding of the dividing line between the policymaker, the decision maker, and the intelligence world. What is different, and what I certainly saw change in my embarrassingly long career, and it's nice of you to say that I joined in the 1970s, didn't go into too much detail, which part of the 1970s, is that the intelligence sort of services and capabilities, just because of the knowledge and expertise and contribution that they can present, of course, are drawn, certainly in the UK, into the sort of centre of the government, and how they then behave in that centre of government is the important issue. But they're sort of centrally involved in the key meetings and National Security Council and all this sort of thing, in a way that simply wasn't true when I started my career.
There are risks to that, though, aren't there?
Of course there are. Of course there are. There are big risks to it. But what do you want? For them not to be involved and for their capabilities not to be deployed in support and in an attempt to get government policy right. And if mistakes are made and things are got wrong, then of course they have to take the weight of that too. But it's a very interesting feature, and you can see it happen over the decades from the sort of 80s onwards.
John McLaughlin, CIA has sometimes been criticised as being too close to the White House.
Intelligence has to walk a fine line here. In other words, on the one hand, you are a member of the team, particularly in a conflict, in a war. You want your side to win too. So you've got to be a member of the team. On the other hand, you have to be the one who walks into the room, we say skunk at the picnic, and says, by the way, it isn't working. And as someone who's done that many times, let's say, use the phrase everyone uses, spoken truth to power, sometimes power doesn't like it. But you still have to do it. I don't accept the judgment that we were somehow too close, and I can give you, just as one example, the fact that the CIA successfully resisted a strong commitment, strong view on the part of many policymakers during that very period that somehow Saddam had been behind 9/11. We said,
yes,
no, he wasn't.
Correct.
There's no operational connection, no control. That's not on. You can read various commission reports documenting that both the British and the American services took that position and held it against considerable conviction on the part of many policymakers. Now, that said, of course, intelligence around the world was wrong about Iraq WMD, and that was a consequential failure. And we can talk more about that. We learned a lot from it. We learned a lot from that. Intelligence really went to school on that failure, intensely. And I would say many things that have happened successfully since then, including the locating bin Laden and taking him down as Admiral McRaven's people did in 2011, was in large part a result of studying what had gone wrong years earlier. And additionally, I would say on that point, when you go back and look, intelligence success and failure, it's a tricky thing. In that very period, when we got Iraq WMD wrong, we got Korean efforts to cheat on plutonium exactly right. We discovered in 2002, I remember doing the briefing, that North Korea was acquiring materials that appeared to be for uranium enrichment at a moment when they said they were out of that business, out of the enrichment business with plutonium. And we didn't know where this was happening. We didn't know how far along it was, but we had conviction on that. Turned out to be right, and that was the same kind of issue. So sometimes when intelligence is failing in one place, it's succeeding in another. I can use a sports metaphor from the United States.
Sure, we'll manage.
I don't know how many people here are into basketball and baseball. The Americans all are. In basketball, to succeed, if you're a foul shooter, you've got to hit about 85% of your shots, okay? In baseball, to succeed, you can get into the All-Star game with a 300 batting average. So where do you want intelligence to be on that spectrum of difficulty? Over toward 90%. Of course, that's where we try to be. But remember, in intelligence, you're dealing all the time with incomplete information, opponents who are trying to deceive you and deny you that information, and pressure to come to conclusions. It's a tough business.
If I can just, again, pick out an area where, in my own personal experience or career experience, I would say, is a great potential strength of the particular work and possibilities in good intelligence, and what can mark it out if you get it right, is the ability to sort of see the world and to see issues through the eyes of the other side, or get inside the brain of the other side. I tended to think that above all else, that is the top target for successful intelligence work. And somehow it's reasonable to see that as something that intelligence can do. Maybe it's more difficult for other people, decision makers, policy makers, and so on to do. And we were talking earlier on at some length about the various issues around Russia. And that seems to me now, and as it was in the past, a very good example of what I'm just talking about.
And that's something that, in your mind, only secret intelligence can do, get inside the mind or the intentions of someone like Vladimir Putin?
No, it's not only, definitely not only secret intelligence, but clearly it can help. If you, because I think it's reasonable to say that policymakers in the Kremlin make some effort to, they're not exactly completely open-minded and transparent, and they are making some effort to conceal, what they're deciding and what they're doing and so on, and get surprised and all the rest of it, and to mislead people and what have you. And it's not only them, by the way, who do that, but it is a particular feature of the policymakers there. And so clearly, sometimes, really to cut through it all, you've got to get to something that only secret intelligence can produce. And it may be pretty limited. It may be quite small. It may be only a small percentage of the total information available, good information available. But I've seen time and time again examples of where just that one crack can make a fundamental difference to your understanding, of a particular problem. That, in essence, is the role of true, really traditional secret intelligence, and I really think that most people from the profession would agree with that.
There is a debate about how much the intelligence community has adapted to a new world of open source information, of big data, of the ability to take Twitter feeds and look at sentiment analysis and look at how maybe a population is thinking and changing, or use it for predictions of unrest even in places. For some of the traditional functions which we thought of as being intelligence community and secret intelligence functions, do you think that Britain and the US have adapted to this new world? Do you think that it does offer these opportunities, which I think a lot of people think it might in the future, of changing, if you like, the way intelligence analysis is done?
The way I would think about that is that it's a work in progress. There's no question that intelligence understands the importance of this new technology, social media, and all that it implies for change in the world. But I say it's a work in progress without, of course, being deeply involved in it personally now. But from what I know, I think what we're seeing is a gradual adaptation to this. And an awareness. Here's the key point. Intelligence is aware, first, that this is something you need to be on top of. And I did do a study for after leaving government, for the Director of National Intelligence in 2010 of something that did surprise the United States, which was the failed so-called Christmas bomber, underwear bomber, whatever you want to call him, Abdul Muttalib, who almost blew up a plane over Detroit. It didn't, but the attempt surprised us. And when we went and look back at that, and this report has just been partially declassified on the web, one of the things we found was that just volume was a problem. In other words, if you could find the 10 reports that you could lay down in a row, you would read them and say, oh, okay, something's going to happen here. But they were lost in thousands of documents because of the explosion of information. And so awareness of things like that is causing the American intelligence community to, the Director of National Intelligence right now has two of his key agencies working on essentially a new information architecture for the intelligence community that would, the phrase we use is that would cause data to speak to data. In other words, at present, you've got to dig through it. You want the data to speak to data and deliver you the kind of things that Amazon delivers you when you order a book, or Google delivers you when you do a search. This is difficult in intelligence because you're kludging together databases from about 28, 30 different agencies of different classification levels in an environment that you're always in of counterintelligence where people are trying to penetrate you and discover these things, or in the case of Edward Snowden, leak them. So again, tough business.
Well, I'm a bit involved in this, and there is no question but the intelligence communities are acutely alert to this issue. Certainly that's true in the UK, and in the US, there's a major reorganization going on at the present time, to respond to this and to make sure that the huge machine there is adaptive and responsive to it. Of course, almost by definition, it's not a question of secrecy. By definition, it's not. But as John said, it fundamentally volume. And then therefore related to that is analytical capability, and how do you adapt analytical capability, which has been developed in other contexts to this complete transformation in volume, both to sort of get the alerts so that you know it when you need to know it, and if it's out there somewhere, then obviously it makes sense that you know about it, and then of course work out the analytical capabilities that are there and potential that's there, but then you've got the big problem of the big data.
Could I just add a point to that, a broader point on this point that John just made? Here's the dilemma for intelligence. Your technology always has to be ahead of what's available publicly, because the adversary always has what's available publicly. So, back in the late 50s, someone has the bright idea, what if we could take photographs from space? And I say that to students today, and they say, film? What's that? Well, of course, now we have Google Earth. It's no longer novel. But back then, we were way ahead. And I can give you other examples from the 70s of things that kind of looked like cell phones back then, before anyone could imagine such a thing. That's also on the web these days. So you can imagine, you've always, and this task has become harder in the era of Silicon Valley, when so much sophisticated technology is being developed in garages around the world and instantly marketed. Exactly. So we're not in the era when intelligence just gave a bunch of money to a big defense contractor and say, build me something. We're in a much more chaotic
To some extent, other countries, even individuals, can acquire some of the high-end intelligence capabilities which were the preserve of a state before.
Well, look what Jim Comey said last night.
Yeah, well, that absolutely.
Whether it's encryption, whether it's satellite photography, whether it's data analysis.
Yeah, but
changing the intelligence.
So you can imagine that today intelligence must be pretty good to be ahead of that.
Yeah.
How far ahead, I suppose, is the question. And how important is human intelligence still in that? Because in this world of data, some people would say data, GCHQ, NSA are now the giants of the intelligence world in terms of size and budget.
Always
manpower. Always true, but the dominance of data, has human intelligence still got a role?
Well, I've got a standard answer to this one, because I'm the chairman of the trustees at Bletchley Park, okay? And in 1945, that's exactly what people said. That now the incredible success of the intelligence and the intercept and communications achievement out of what was done there means that that's the future, and human intelligence is irrelevant. That was 70 years ago. Okay, and my career started quite some time after that, and it was in human intelligence, sort of time and time again, one sees where it makes a difference. Just quoting two obvious examples. You can deploy an enormous amount of technology and around, let's say, studying terrorist activity, studying movements, studying grouping, studying associations, finance, and so on. And that can be a fundamental basis which can begin to identify the target that you've really got to worry about and so on, group identification. But if you've got a human source inside the group that is actually plotting the attack, that's better. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then indeed you can deploy, and I've seen it happen many times, all the technology to support the investigation which comes because you know where to look in the first place.
So it's the integration of the human and the
of course.
electronic.
We call it tipping and cueing.
Yeah.
Something tips you to something, cues you to go somewhere else, and human intelligence is essential in that whole process. It gets you under the roof. So in 2007, someone sees from space a facility out in the Syrian desert. That's all you can see, a building. Look online, a CIA video has been declassified on this issue, Syria 2007. Funny, in that video there are photographs of something on the ground. Who did that? You didn't do that from space. But time and time again, intelligence problems are solved not by a unique single source, but by the integration of all of these sources. And human intelligence, been there since biblical times, always will be.
Yeah, that's. If I make one slightly historical point here as well, sorry to be a bit historian, a final point. Another example of that is an enormous technological and sophisticated effort for its time was built up around NATO operations and so on in the 1980s, in Central Europe and so on. And we thought we had really a fundamentally good understanding of Warsaw Pact maneuvers and capabilities and intentions and attitudes. But when it was spotted that something odd was happening in late 1983 in response to a NATO command and control exercise, famously now, for those who watched Deutschland 83, Able Archer, what told us actually what was behind that behavior on the Soviet and Warsaw Pact side was straightforward, old-fashioned human intelligence reporting.
Or the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everyone thinks of the photographs. How we interpreted the photographs was largely through the testimony of Oleg Penkovsky, who told us more or less what to look for in those photographs to understand that this was Soviet medium-range missile facility.
Penkovsky debriefed in Marble Arch, just up the road, actually, by joint CIA-SIS team. Okay, I think we're heading towards questions now. I've got a few more, but I think I better let other people ask some as well. I've got one here at the front.
So, of course, intelligence involves both collection and analysis, and you've talked about how there's so much data coming in, so perhaps we've solved much of the collection issue. But, after 9/11, we had so many new analysts who had no context and understanding. So how do you get them up to speed quickly enough that they can take all this information and pick out what's important and pick out what's different that they should be thinking about, because they just have no context and experience. They're really smart, but they don't really have the history that helps them understand what's really important and what the meaning is and how to interpret it.
Train them. We created a school, 2000, to do exactly that. Still going and getting better. Took a while. But you train them in basically thinking about thinking. So you take them through techniques like structured brainstorming, quantitative analysis, Delphi analysis, red teaming, devil's advocacy. In other words, how do you check your own thinking? How do you challenge your assumptions? I had a sign hanging in my office which sounds vaguely menacing, so anyone in my office could see it. It said, "Subvert the dominant paradigm," which meant don't accept what you see, what you're thinking. You just push and push and push, but this is hard too. It's very hard because we interpret things as through a prism, all of us, and you just have to fight it all the time.
And it's not true that we have solved the collection problem, actually.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
Okay, I've had one question over here, please.
Thank you. Thomas Simolaritas from APCO Worldwide. How do you create incentives for very secretive institutions to cooperate between each other, between different countries, which, as we've seen with the terrorist attack in Paris and Brussels, apparently was a major issue, the lack of communication? And I have a second question, which is, you are reporting to the political leadership of your respective countries. How sometimes would you consider communicating to the outside world on some of the issues you consider that are important, and when you see that the leadership of the country is not listening to you? Is this happening sometimes?
Yeah. Two very interesting
I've
questions.
never heard about it, of course.
On the collaboration point, I think we need to be careful here, actually. It's become an accepted truth in the aftermath of Brussels and Paris and so on, that there isn't good enough collaboration. It's not as simple as that. There's a huge amount of collaboration in different fora and in different contexts. But clearly, it could ideally, in an ideal world, be better. It's easy to make judgments about that from the outside, but if you have collected and hold very sensitive, very secret information, of course you're careful about who you share it with and who knows about it. It's a very sophisticated business. You can't just spread it around without care. You can't just dare to share. That's one of the lessons, of course, one of the other lessons of recent years. This is a complicated area, but it's fast moving, and we have to adapt to the threat that we see it. And quite clearly, in that particular case of counterterrorism work in the, let's say, in the EU and Schengen area and so on, this is fast moving stuff, and it has to adapt. That is clear, to me, and I was there.
The old Five Eyes model doesn't really work anymore, does it?
Well, no,
we share very closely in the Five Eyes, and it's just a little
no, but
bit...
it's never. But people talk about the Five Eyes since it became known, after Snowden, that the Five Eyes existed. Everybody talks about that, and suddenly, I kept on getting people coming up and applying to join, so that it. I've never known a club which has had so many potential members. But at the end of the day, it's Five Eyes, that's it. But it's vastly more complicated than that. I wrote, unusually so I can quote it, an op-ed the other month in which I mentioned the point that when I was about to leave the service and so on, and I was looking back over things, one of the questions I asked my colleagues was, in the 5 years plus when I'd been head of the service, from how many services around the world, not just in Europe or the Five Eyes, had we received intelligence reporting of direct relevance and to operational relevance to counter-terrorist investigations? And the answer was 60 separate services, not countries, from around the world. And I quote that just to make the point that this work is far more complicated than the Five Eyes. Five Eyes is a fundamentally important thing, but I'm getting fed up with hearing about it because it's leading to a misunderstanding of what really happens.
I'll take the second part of your question. Although just on the first part, I would say the incentive for us in the United States, I'd say what John said as well, the myth that we weren't talking to each other before 9/11, we certainly could have done better, but we weren't at war with each other as often portrayed. But after 9/11, the incentive was that 9/11 happened. In other words, sharing information, intelligence information, involves a risk that you will compromise and lose some of it because you're putting it out more broadly. We simply calculated that the risk of not sharing it was greater than the risk of sharing it. And I think that was the right calculation. So we've really worked this in the States. On your second question, I once had a senator ask me in testimony when he knew that we disagreed with the Bush administration on a particular issue, why don't you call a press conference and tell the world you disagree? Well, it's a fair question. But what I said was, it's my duty to tell the official that I disagree, and to do it in writing, which I did. And that was reasonably effective. If you're at the point where you want to call a press conference, I think you're ready to resign.
Yes.
And that's a fair outcome as well.
I entirely agree with that. I was about to say exactly the same thing. If you feel that strongly and the problem is that big, then, really it's hard to think exactly of when that might happen, then you resign.
But you do owe it to power, let's use that term, to be very clear when you disagree and to say, you can have that, here's what we used to say, you can have that opinion, you have a brain too, you're reading all the reporting, but you cannot say that that's the opinion of the intelligence community.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more quick questions. Maybe get one here.
Thank you very much. I'm Crawford Thomas from Clydesdale Bank. I've got a background in human intelligence from UK Armed Forces, and I was going to ask about something that was touched on about the FBI. Mentioned yesterday the director about human intelligence and having people on the ground and maybe bobbies on the street and things like that, but we can influence that. But I would like to talk or ask the question about the skunk at the picnic, really, the dodgy dossier and understanding, the language of understanding within intelligence that I don't think is understood by sometimes the decision maker. So it's a gift within the intelligence community that we understand that language, saying likely, probable, blah, 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 and understanding those percentages, but the decision maker sometimes doesn't. Do you think that this could have been worded better for 45 minutes, sort of WMD?
Well, I mean, the point about getting language right and understanding the difference between language which is suitable for experienced policymakers and language which is suitable for the media is, of course, is clearly is a good one. I'm not sure really it's easy to sort of go beyond that really, but I mean the basic point clearly language is important. Yeah.
And one of the lessons of Iraq, I suppose, was that public understanding of that language and the ability to, if you're going to put intelligence in the public domain, you think quite carefully about it.
One of the lessons learned.
One of the big lessons learned.
One of the big lessons
because
learned.
it's happening more and more. I mean, you saw it with the, I thought it was interesting with the Syrian chemical weapons issue. There was this pressure. We want to see the intelligence. The public now expects to know what intelligence lies behind a decision. When the administration was considering a strike, some of it came out. So there's an expectation now from the public to see almost not even assessed intelligence, sometimes raw intelligence, and to know it. Do you think is that healthy? Is it realistic?
It's, as John said on a number of things, complicated. I think. Up to a point, it's realistic, but again, intelligence has to earn public trust, and the Iraq issue set it back considerably on both sides of the Atlantic. And looking back at it, we could do an excavation of that endlessly here, but the point was going to an earlier point that someone made about language. When we look back, one of the problems was not expressing uncertainty as clearly as we should have. But it's more complicated than that, because in our writing on this, there was maybe 10% of it was dissents, which somehow went past a lot of people who should have seen that it was not as solid as it could have been interpreted. So I don't know the answer to that question about how much the public should see. I think obviously the dilemma is if you put it all out there, you sometimes lose the
edge.
You lose the edge, and if you don't put it out there, you probably struggle with public confidence on issues of controversy.
I think that's right, and obviously a lesson from all that period is that how you publish and talk about publicly intelligence needs very careful thought. But I don't actually accept that there is a great public demand to see the intelligence.
So the media.
The media say it, of course, and some politicians and so on say it. But it's never been my experience that the great British public thinks that. And there's a great deal of evidence to show that the great British public understands perfectly well that intelligence is supposed to stay secret.
This is also why what we call congressional oversight is so important in the United States, because if you have trust in the Congress,
Pause.
we have two committees that are entitled to see everything, and they do. Increasingly, they see everything.
They do.
And and that is how we are connected to the public. So when that relationship is healthy, I think it cancels out a lot of this issue. And it's healthy sometimes, and sometimes it isn't. Right now, it's probably somewhere in between. But that's why that is so important to get that right.
They sometimes forget they've seen it, I've noticed.
Yes, there's a little of that going on.
Got
yeah.
one more question here at the back.
Yeah.
Certainly now, because the ministers in Iceland, you've been there for a very, very long time. And my concern before I retired was less about ministers, more about officials and their understanding of what intelligence actually means.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point, that whether the public, whether officials have the sufficient understanding and how long it takes officials to learn that. And then that goes to the point we had earlier about public understanding as well. How much do the public grasp about intelligence? How much do they need to know? How much do they appreciate the need for it to remain secret in some cases?
Well, yes, I'd only say to that over the last 20 plus years, there's been a vast increase in the UK in the amount of information which is available to the public, to the media, or whatever, about the intelligence community, the intelligence services, what they do, why they do it, and so on.
And to take John's point, you think ministers as well have, and officials have the understanding to deal with this stuff?
Well, it depends on their background, but clearly if you have a policy-making machine and a government machine which is properly structured and has a good career and training development and so on, then it, by definition, and this is something we've been doing for hundreds of years, by definition, by the time they reach the decision-making level, they should be capable of managing that. Obviously, it can be more difficult with politicians because they might come suddenly from nowhere, and then there is a big education and briefing exercise involved. But then the longer they're in government, the less that becomes an issue.
Great. I think we're out of time. I could ask you about President Trump and the CIA and what the relationship is likely to be, but I'm not sure if you're going to answer that in election season.
I've briefed 4 presidents, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, with that, we're out of time, I'm afraid, but thank you very much. If you could join me in thanking both Johns. Thank you.